Welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, we welcome you. And if you've seen some of our previous sessions and some of our entertainment sessions, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and we really hope you enjoyed it. Now, we will resume our scheduled session. Our next presentation is the role of geodiversity and heritage in building awareness and resilience in the Caribbean, which will be followed by a live Q&A with our presenters. So please enjoy.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. What I would like to do this afternoon is give you a whirlwind tour of the geodiversity of the Caribbean. We have a really special region. It is known for its extraordinary geodiversity. Every single nation and every island in the Caribbean has a unique and special geology that reflects the very complex tectonic setting in which the Caribbean exists. And so this geodiversity is a backdrop to our landscape and also underpins the fantastic biodiversity of the Caribbean and the way in which our ancestors and today the people of the Caribbean interact with this landscape. It's also the backdrop for a set of common geologic hazards. And so what I would like to do is begin by reminding you about plate tectonics and what's operating in the Caribbean. So as a reminder, we have an Earth that is covered by a number of major plates, and the Caribbean plate is one of them, and it is in the middle with a circle around it in the image on the left. The image on the right shows you a close-up, and there you can see more detail about the tectonic setting. There are different plate boundaries that we have between the different plates. They are jostling one against the other, and as they do so, you have a lot of processes that take place: mountain building, the generation of earthquakes, and then also the development of volcanoes. And so when you look at this Caribbean plate, you'll see three main types of boundaries. In the north, where you've got that green broad zone, you will have what's known as a transform boundary, and that's where the plates are moving past each other. We often think of it as sliding, but that's not true. They're moving. The movement of the plates, one past the other, occurs in fits and starts, and you can have the plate being locked. And in the south, there's a similar boundary. To the eastern part of the Caribbean, we have a collisional plate boundary, and that's where we have processes of subduction, a fancy word for material that's being driven back down into the earth at the eastern margin of the Caribbean plate, and this creates volcanoes. All of the islands of the Eastern Caribbean are volcanic in nature. I want to call attention to a couple of places. We've got Barbados that is out to the eastern part of the Caribbean, and Barbados formed a little bit differently in that it is material that was scraped up off of the ocean floor and then piled on top of the advancing Caribbean plate. And Trinidad is in an area where the plate boundary is changing from a transform or a sliding boundary to one where you have mountain building and volcanic activity taking place, and it's being torqued or squeezed. And in the north, if we go back up to the area that's the Greater Antilles and these larger islands, we also need to consider the Cayman Islands. And there's a little red part of that plate boundary zone where we have the creation or the development of a divergent or a pulling apart boundary. And there are very deep submarine volcanoes in a zone that's known as the Mid-Cayman Spreading zone. So in this talk today, I'm going to focus on these three areas, really the Greater Antilles, the larger islands in Cayman. And then we're also going to look at the Eastern Caribbean. And then I will call out again, Barbados and Trinidad, but say just a few words about Trinidad. Cayman is, again, I stress, part of the Greater Antilles. And so this is just another example of the Greater Antilles area, the northern plate boundary. And you can see that there is also a microplate that is squashed in between. It's called the Gonav microplate. And it's a very, very active area. You can see that there have been some recent earthquakes that have taken place here. In January 28th, 2020, there was a large earthquake to the northwest of Jamaica. And then, of course, there are the two Haitian earthquakes, the one in January 2010 that was so devastating, and then the recent one on August 14th in 2021. These Haitian earthquakes are occurring along what we call the Enriquillo Plant and Garden Fault. And I want you to note that that goes right through Jamaica and it bends a little bit as it comes through Kingston and by the Blue Mountains. So we've mentioned the recent earthquakes that have occurred, but in the past, there were some really famous earthquakes. And of course, the Port Royal earthquake stands out because it is where supposedly the wickedest city in the world, Port Royal, met its demise as it slid off into the ocean due to liquefaction that happened with the Port Royal earthquake of 1692. The ground opened up, bodies were swallowed, and this is depicted in this beautiful mural that was painted by Ardennes High School students in Jamaica. Of course, just a mere 215 years later, Kingston was struck by a devastating earthquake, and almost every single building in Kingston was damaged in some way, but it was a horrific event. There was screaming in the streets when it occurred. Hundreds of people lay dead after three major shocks. They were either dead or dying on the ground. And this, in a way, is personal to me because my grandmother lost her baby brother, George, in this earthquake. They lived in a part of Kingston known as Raytown. So this is just an image from Iris's earthquake browser, and it shows the cluster of some recent earthquakes. And you can really look and see the cluster in Haiti that coincides with the epicenter of the two most recent earthquakes. And then look over to Kingston, where we fortunately have not had a major earthquake in a while. But there you can see that there's a cluster by the Blue Mountains and right to the east of Kingston. So knowing about this is important. It helps us to plan. I want to point out that St. Lucia's poet laureate, Derek Walcott, has written really eloquently in his poetry about the way in which the peoples of the Caribbean are so connected to the land. There's a beautiful poem called Earth that he's written. And of course, this poetry and this connection is prevalent, it's ubiquitous really throughout the Caribbean region. And I want to call attention to this poem by Jamaican poet Kai Miller. And the title of it is What the Mapmaker Ought to Know. And it really speaks to these hazards that we live with. So on this island, things fidget. Landmarks shift, become unfixed by earthquake, by landslide, by utter spite. Whole places will slip out from your grip. So again, showing the deep connection that we have as people to this landscape. I want to move on and talk too a bit about how these forces, these tectonic forces can create disasters, but they're also positive things about them. And so we have the beautiful Blue Mountains that have been uplifted, the Blue Mountains and the Jonkro Mountains. And humans, our ancestors, and the indigenous people that inhabited this, the Caribbean region, interacted profoundly with this landscape. And one of the great examples of this are the Maroons, the Cormorante Maroons of eastern Jamaica. And they used a bull's horn as an instrument, a communication instrument. The abeng is what it's called. And they could use this to communicate across the valleys and from one mountaintop to the next. The Maroons, as you might remember, were the escaped enslaved people that combined with the indigenous Taino of the area. And they lived in inaccessible mountainous regions after the British invaded, actually they were the English, I think at that time, invaded and captured the island of Jamaica. But they could communicate with different sounds and rhythms in ways that would issue warnings about when the enemy was going to invade, or just to transmit information from one group, one community to the next. And it is said that the Maroons have never shared the codes that they used with the abeng outside of their communities. And of course, who cannot talk about the wonderful environment that the Blue Mountains sets, this beautiful climate, the mist that you see that is almost always present, and the fertile volcanic soil of the region has given rise to the growth of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee, which is the rarest and most sought after in the world. I want to move now to the Lesser Antilles, the eastern part of the volcano, where we have this chain of islands, this volcanic arc that extends from South America all the way up to the Greater Antilles. And these, as I mentioned earlier, are formed as a consequence of this process of subduction. And so you will see that you've got the 19 volcanic islands that exist. And there is earthquake activity there too, which really tracks the way in which the Atlantic Ocean floor is subducting underneath the Caribbean plate. The purple dots are shallow and the green and yellow ones are deeper. So these islands were thought to have been extinct or really quiet for a while, although some of them have been active on and off over the decades. But most recently, people in the Eastern Caribbean and government officials have been very, very concerned about the rumbling back to life of many of these volcanoes. And of course, La Soufrière St. Vincent is a great example. It has erupted many times during our historical period, starting in 1902, and then the most recent one being last year in April of 2021. And so smoke and ash billowed from La Soufrière as it erupted in April of 2021. And this wreaked havoc in the region because, of course, the ash spread not only over St. Vincent and people had to be evacuated, but it also spread to other Caribbean islands and threatened the water supply of the people who lived on these islands and St. Vincent. And so part of what we are doing here is making sure that this understanding of our geodiversity contributes to the knowledge that is so important to us to building a resilient society. And the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center in St. Augustine does that through lots of educational outreach programs that it has. And so I wanted to mention too that in 1902 there was this period of what's known as the twin catastrophes, where there were two horrendous episodes where we had volcanic eruptions. In Martinique, Mount Pelée erupted and really created this thing we call a nuée ardente, or a fiery cloud that really incinerated the area, including Saint-Pierre in Martinique. And then we also had La Soufrière in St. Vincent erupting just before that, as well. And so the Museum of Natural History sent out a geologist who studied the area and really learned a whole lot that has contributed to our understanding of the way in which we know that volcanoes formed, and also the way in which we understand how communities respond to them, what happened to the people. And so here I want to mention that in Martinique, there is the Memorial de la Catastrophe. I'm just going to say it in English, the Memorial to the Catastrophe of 1902. And this museum was recently renovated, I think in 2018, and it shifted its focus a little bit so that it focused on the cultural approach to catastrophes and what the people experienced. And it also memorializes those who perished in the disaster. But again, the point is that preparedness can make all the difference. These museums and monuments and public education programs can save lives and contribute to a resilient society as we understand the causes and how we respond and what we need to do. And so I also mentioned that Barbados is a bit of an outlier, and I'd like to mention that this has a legacy of extraordinary scientific merit that I want to let you know. It has been uplifting as these plate processes take place. And so we have these coral reefs that are very important, and they're living coral reefs now, but we have uplifted ones. And this has contributed to the study of these ancient reefs and understanding how sea level has changed over time. This is really, really important because as we face a changing climate and sea level is rising, this information comes from our island of Barbados. So I would like to also call your attention to a really beautiful poem by Lorna Goodison, who is one of Jamaica's best known, actually one of the Caribbean's most celebrated poets. And the title of her poem is Reporting Back to Queen Isabella. And she says, when he came to Jamaica, he described it so, the fairest eye that eyes ever beheld, an overabundance of wood, over 100 rivers, food and fat pastures for Spanish horses, men and cattle. And yes, Your Majesty, there were some people. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge that the original indigenous settlers of the Caribbean region were the Kalinago and the Taino, and to honor them for having come before us, but also to remind everybody that we also share a colonial heritage in the Caribbean, and we have now a population that is as mixed and as diverse as the landscapes that we inhabit. And so together we can work and contribute and understand our environment, understand the geodiversity, understand our heritage and how it can help us to build a much more resilient society. And so in closing, I would like to again just remind you that we have this beautiful geodiversity, which is a backdrop not just to the beauty, the natural beauty, the environment that attracts people from all over the world, but it connects us. We are connected through our geoheritage, and that we can make our space and our collections in museums and our people much more resilient by embracing this shared geoheritage and cultural heritage. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Again, I would like to acknowledge Shireen and Georgian and Stephanie, and pass this now on to Shireen, who will offer the next presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Kathy. That was awesome. I'm going to chime in here, and I'm going to give you a little bit of Caribbean geoheritage in context, a sort of a virtual outlook as what the possibilities are. So first, let me tell you, my presentation will just look at generally the virtual context, what that means, virtual reality, augmented reality, gamification, cartoons and animation, and short films as part of this virtual sort of, I would say, revolution, and a sort of a Caribbean geo tour, if you will, to just give you a teaser of what is possible and what we might be working on. So in terms of the virtual context, what we want to do is to bring to life our geoheritage, and we want to bring that as a connection between our intangible and our tangible heritage. All of what is derived from the physical, we can make connections with those, and we can use technology to help us to become more resilient, to teach each other, to learn more about the region, and to present ourselves as a cohesive force somewhat, to be able to handle what it is that is presented to us in our hazards, in our risks, in our disasters. And because we share a heritage, looking at each other through a lens from sitting in Jamaica, for example, and being able to see something in Trinidad, especially now that we're unable to travel, is absolutely, absolutely important. There are tours around now that have developed just because of COVID. And as a result, we can see how a lot of these technology that we've just been, utilizing on recreation but in this case, we want to visualize heritage that is inaccessible. So we can't just walk up the side of a volcano. We can't just walk into danger zones. We can't just go to a flood-prone area. We can't just go to a museum where the roof has just blown off or something because of a hurricane. We can access places that are dangerous. So you might have a building that it's not stable for somebody to walk into, but certainly if you have video footage, 360 video footage that somebody can actually put on a visor and be able to see what inside of this building is, see the features, look at the architecture. There's a lot that we can learn about. We can also learn about heritage that has been lost. So we know, for example, in Kingston after the 1907 earthquake, that there were buildings that were never rebuilt. But let's say, for argument's sake, we have images of what the inside of this building would look like. We could possibly use virtual reality to explore. We could also, for example, well, let's just go on and I'll show you some of those. So here, these are a few examples of using virtual reality. Now, the first one is just a snapshot of the University of Portsmouth. They're participating in this Erasmus project, which is a European-wide project, and it's called 3D TLC. And essentially, they're using this geoheritage and georisk, using virtual reality to display and communicate geoheritage and georisk as one of the outputs. This started out as an educational project. So students can actually do geological mapping and geoheritage mapping anywhere that that is part of the program and be able to create maps. Now, if you can create a map of somewhere, you can put the landmarks, you can put the sites, you can put the heritage features, you can add the story. And with that, you use a visor, as you can see in this image to the top right-hand corner. You'll see this person with a headset and some tools in her hand. And this is basically how virtual reality works. Now, that same picture is depicting coral acidification, and it's one of the programs at Stanford University. This is part of their research, and they use virtual reality to be able to show people and to get people to appreciate what our activities on land, how it impacts the oceans. And then at the bottom here, it says 10 of the best virtual reality travel experiences. I would suggest that you Google this after this presentation and look it up. There are 10 places including the pyramids, that they have actually made into virtual reality. So you can visit Egypt if you've never been able to afford to go. You can sit in your living room and visit Egypt and have a good time. And that is basically how we want to be able to use virtual reality. That brings us to augmented reality, or AR. And we can transform our tourist experience, we can transform our museum experience by just providing this medium that allows us to see, for example, what is not there. We can allow persons to have this immersive navigation where you're able to just connect with an app, and you wonder, oh, well, just another app. But for your tourist boards, they could actually make money. When you get to the airport, there's a big QR code or a big link or something, and you connect and you have hotspots all over your country, and people can just navigate themselves and basically see the place the way locals see it, which is very, very important for travelers these days. So this is a sort of a quick picture of something that could work. So here, you would be able to pull out your app and you'd be able to see, if you can imagine, if you're walking through Bridgetown, Barbados, you can see the various places, including shops and food and museums. It will give you a direct path to a museum or heritage site, or a botanical gardens or somewhere. And this will, it also tells you, for example, because depending on how it's developed, it tells you how long it will take you to get there. Not only that, but when you get there, it tells you you're there and then gives you further information. So that's one way augmented reality works. Another way is to see what's not there. So this particular image here, is in Dresden, and here's a church, and what it can show you, for example, it is if this church, let's say it was destroyed by, you know, fire, war, etc. What you can find is that once you hold up your device, you are able to see the items in the landscape that are no longer there, but you see them as they would have been and how they were situated. And so, you know, it gives you that kind of snapshot to be able to immerse yourself in a culture, in an experience, in a heritage walk. Here we have augmented reality being used. This is a World War II Drain the Oceans Nat Geo image here, and we've just used augmented reality here to show you what the extent of this this ship, you know, build it out as it would have been in its, you know, if it were on top of the sea. And here you can see our monuments, for example, in Rome and places in ancient Greece and so on, just to expand that architectural view of a ruin so that you can see what it was. We have lots of ruins across the Caribbean, little castles and forts. Some of them are damaged. Imagine if somebody who is interested in forts and fortification were to just go from island to island, just looking at forts. The ones that have been damaged, you hold up your device, and of course you'd be able to see it as it was, you know, and with video technology, you could even see what people were doing at the time. In your museum, you could allow people to be able to see, for example, where you have fossils that are skeletal, or, you know, not complete fossils, just maybe parts of them. You can use augmented reality and virtual reality to allow you to see what this item would look like in real life. Gamification is another one. Now, I don't know if I'm dating myself here, but I used to play Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. This game has gone through various iterations over time. But essentially, the games already exist to assist us in our own cause. So we have escape room games, we have Monopoly. Imagine creating a Monopoly-like game where you have, instead of the utilities, you have natural disasters. And instead of community chest and chance, you have the disaster that you'll read upon, and it will tell you where it occur. So you lose your properties, something will get damaged, you lose money, you have to spend money to fix up something. This kind of an idea is presented not only for adults, but also for children to learn how to function in a disaster or disaster setting. Then we have animation and cartoons. We already have them. We have Dino Dan and Dino Dana out of Canada, and they have they teach children about dinosaurs. As an adult, I mean, I watch them and they're absolutely fascinating. And those of us who grew up on Captain Planet, the power is yours, right? So all of these, including Magic School Bus and Sesame Street, Bill Nye, and even Octonauts are some examples of how TV shows actually provide information. Now, how is this important? Well, if you think of YouTube and you think of Netflix or one of these other type of scenarios, you have recommendation engines. You ever watch something and you open your YouTube and you just have a flood of them? It can direct you towards additional programs. And so we can sort of tailor a series of programs about the Caribbean once we create them, and it will push them, and you can create them in such a way that they will drive the traffic according to even regions and specific IP addresses. So in the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about just a thought, about a Caribbean geotour. We're currently trying to prepare one for Jamaica as part of our UNESCO project. But think for a minute that we can have, well, what we want to do is be able to prepare the same thing online that is on the ground. So signs, lots of signs, big signs. And these signs would be interactive. They could be in Braille. They could be it could have all kinds of material that would engage any person, any age, and any disability. What we want is that this sign is present in the virtual space as well as in the physical space. Whatever you have online, whatever you're walking through with your visor, if you decided to visit country X or country Y, you would be able to immerse yourself in that same walk and have a similar experience, except you can actually touch and feel something tangible. And of course, meet people along the way to give you, local stories. So if we were to showcase this geotour, how could we do it? We could use underwater heritage as a theme. We could use disaster heritage as a theme. We could use World Heritage Sites as a theme. We could use prehistory as a theme. Any of these could work for us to actually just go from island to island, just experiencing what happens, and completely virtual in some sense. So I don't think I'll go through every single one of these in detail, but imagine being online and you can just click on one of these little pins and it takes you to Belize, for argument's sake. So if we look at underwater heritage, it's good for ecotourism, it's good for environmental conservation, it's good for recreation and entertainment, and above all, it's good for education. So we don't have one of these yet in the Caribbean. It would be nice if we did, but then you have people who are claustrophobic, you have people who are really afraid of water and would not be caught in one of these. And if you're like me, who watched Jaws as a small child, it might bring back some not so great memories. But certainly something like this, to be able to see underwater, would be extremely, extremely useful. So we could see Belize, right? All of their underwater tours, you would be able to experience some of these tours. Look at Blue Hole. When you dive into Blue Hole and get into some of these underwater caves, the views are fantastic. Imagine using that as your snapshot. Cayman Islands, they have so many shipwrecks off of their coast that they have tours about it, right? Snorkel around the world. Right now, it's part of a larger program, but you can do this, virtually without, if you're afraid of water, stepping foot in some. But also, you can then have an experience ahead of going to the Cayman Islands and being able to experience what it is you want to experience in reality. In Grenada, this one is used for conservation. And it depicts various parts of the history and heritage of Grenada. If you look at this one in the middle here, you can see this was shortly after the park started. But then if you look at the other images, you'll see, especially this one right here, you'll see how much coral growth and how much organisms are actually on it. So it actually is doing what it's supposed to. But you want to get up close and personal, and you want to look at all the organisms and the species, but you don't dive like this guy, or you can't get to Grenada. But you can use virtual reality. You can view it on your computer, or you can view it using this visor and be able to feel as though you've been immersed in water, and you can move around and see exactly as the things are in time and in space. Disaster heritage, well, that works well for absence heritage, heritage that is not gone because anybody destroyed it, but because it got destroyed in a historic event. It builds awareness, there's disaster preparedness, there's resilience, there's education, and best of all, we memorialize our events in this particular way. And so if we were to look at Montserrat, for example, this is a nice view. There was some ashfall here, but it's the best image I could find. And what you have is Plymouth before the full deluge of ash. And then you had ash. And then you have this. Imagine being able to, using a visor, do a sort of a walkthrough or helicopter tour or something in your mind's eye using a VR visor to be able to see your grandmother's house if you're you know, a descendant of somebody who lived in Montserrat, and you would be able to see your neighbor's house. I mean, everybody's house won't be on the image, but in the fly through, but certainly even historic buildings and historic sites. But that connects you to the space that you now cannot actually venture to, and so you'd be able to see what was seen back then and have that contrast about how your family would have lost, you know, what they had and why they had to move to a different location. You know, this kind of information is very useful, especially for persons who have to deal with loss and have to, you know, sort of deal with and present them their heritage and feel a part of that heritage. Another way is, and I like this one, even though it's not, it's just an overlay that I created so this is one of the things. So I'll go back and show you. So this is the clock tower. It's the war memorial, and the war memorial, this is what's left of it. But if you were to hold up your device, if we created an augmented reality scenario, you would be able to see what the building and what the war memorial looked like back in its day before it got inundated by ash. And I think that is spectacular for anybody who would, you know, would be able to walk through and have a look. You know, it's a far-fetched example because, you know, you can't go to some of these places, but certainly within controlled scenarios, some things can happen. And then of course, Jamaica, disaster heritage, Port Royal. Now, looking at this historic map, imagine having this historic map on your tablet and you're able to walk through Port Royal and be able to stop at St. Paul's Church, be able to go to where the fish market was, be able to go to where the warehouses were, be able to just stop at these different locations and see what you can see, what is no longer there. But then you can, for example, Fort James is underwater, right? It's part of the section that's underwater. But if you get to the farthest point and hold out your hold up your device, you'll be able to see what was, or at least an artist's depiction of what was in Port Royal. So this is an artist's reconstruction, Peter Dunn. He does quite a few of these and they're actually marvelous. And it shows you how Port Royal got inundated and how far and how much damage occurred. So this is Fort James, doesn't occur anymore. If you watch that documentary, Nat Geo, Drain the Wicked City, you'll be able to see some of the reconstructions and what the underwater archaeology says. And this is another one that just shows you some of what occurred. And then this is from Nat Geo. This is the underwater archaeology. This is what we can see in parts of Port Royal underwater. Then this is Kingston, the top picture is King Street, and this is the St. Andrew Parish Church, and this is the Wesley Chapel. Let me show you what it looked like after the 1907 earthquake. Now, you would be walking downtown, you'd have a sign or something, but you have this app and you can hold up your device, and here it shows you that the Wesley Chapel had 2 stories. That's new. That's a different part of the narrative. Why doesn't it have 2 stories anymore? The top one fell off. And then this is King Street again, and you can see St. Andrew Parish Church somewhere up in the distance, right? So it gives you an idea of what you can see or could see, or what the place looked like after this major event. And then, of course, there's World Heritage, and I really love this mural. It's from Vinales in Cuba, and it depicts a lot of Cuba's heritage. You have the indigenous people, you have dinosaurs, they have lots of that, and they have all these ammonites and other things that are rich in their geology, and they've displayed it in this mural. It's just you know, one of those very interesting things, and it's geology, so of course I'm excited. And then we have something like Barbados, and we have another picture here of Belize. You can see all the pyramids. This is an example of an already laid out tour. All you need is the additional information. So when you hold it up, you can see the images of the little text of what this church is and when it was built, etc. There's a YouTube channel called bookinghunter.com. We watch all the time. And this is what we use when we're trying to think of places to visit. There's somebody walking around with a GoPro camera on their head and just giving you all this information, and it's annotated. So it tells you, you know, the age of this church and that it was destroyed in a war and all of that kind of information. And it brings, you know, tourism to life. So what are the benefits? Potential visitors can plan their trip using online tours. So they can visit Jamaica and they can see ahead of time all the places they want to visit and use that to book their trip, you know, which hotel, which, you know, where to get a rental car, all of these other things. Visitors can arrive and tour themselves. They can pay a small fee for an app. I think people do that all the time, and you can pay for it from your home country, or you can pay for it when you get to the location. It doesn't matter. You have it and you can use it. Register with a tourist board using the app so they know where you are. You're self-touring. They know where to find you. Learn through the eyes of a local. You know, school children and locals alike can spend family time together. So there's a host of things that you can do from, first of all, the comfort of your own home, but secondly, by having that experience of the outdoors, where the outdoors basically and literally talks to you. It won't be easy, it won't be cheap, but I can assure you that it is doable. We have a roadmap. So with that, I'm going to stop there and put you on to Georgianne, who will take the presentation to our resilience place. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Georgianne Dolphy, and this presentation was prepared by myself and Stephanie Parker. And we've been looking at how we can use geodiversity and heritage to actually build resilience. So what does it mean to be resilient? Resilience is the ability of an individual, a household, a community, a country to cope, withstand, and adapt and quickly recover from stresses and shocks, such as violence, pandemics like the one we're in now, economic crises, natural disasters, without actually compromising the person or the country. So there are different avenues through which we can build resilience, and one of them is actually farming. So Catherine earlier actually touched on the volcanic nature of some of these Caribbean islands, and it gives way to fertile soil, as you know, ash and the volcanic rock weathers over time. And we see that in Jamaica, where that has been conducive to the growth of coffee, and in Grenada for their nutmeg. And the topography of the area in which the coffee is grown in Jamaica, the Blue and Jonker Mountains, that actually allows the coffee to thrive, providing sufficient cloud cover, cooler temperatures, and sufficient rainfall. So this is just an image here of some coffee farmers in the Blue Mountain area. And Jamaican coffee has international recognition, and most of our coffee produced is actually exported. And in 2019, we exported roughly $11.9 million worth of coffee. And Grenada, nutmeg is pretty significant to their culture and to their population. You know, it provides income to roughly 30% of the population. You know, this small island supplies 20% of the world's nutmeg. So, you know, Grenada, they've earned the name the Spice Island. You know, nutmeg is such an important part of their culture and heritage. It's actually been incorporated into their flag, as you can see on the left side there. So another way we can build resilience is through green energy. And in the Caribbean, we rely a lot on oil and gas, and we want to move away from that and move towards more green and sustainable sources, especially when we're talking about climate change and considering that electricity, the cost is very high in the region. And so, as we touched on earlier, a lot of these islands, these Caribbean countries, they have volcanic landscapes, which, you know, can be a source of destruction and disaster, but also we can see it as opportunity for development, you know, in terms of energy. We can tap into our geothermal potential of some of these islands. And, you know, currently, you know, we're not really developing that concept, but we see that in Dominica currently, and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean is actually the only island which possesses a geothermal power plant. So this is just an image here showing the volcanic islands of the Lesser Antilles from Saba in the north to Grenada in the south, and in the middle you can see Guadeloupe there. And this is just an image of the Soufrière volcano in Guadeloupe, which affords the country their geothermal power. And this is an image of their power plant, the Buyanti geothermal power plant. And it actually began production in 1996. And a second plant was constructed in 2003. And with that, they supply roughly 15 megawatts of electricity to the nation. And they're actually looking to develop a third power plant to further reach their goal and to further develop their green energy sources. So as mentioned, we have a couple islands, one of them being Dominica, which are developing their geothermal potential. And they actually have a site that is undergoing construction now and is expected to be completed in 2022 and supply roughly 120 megawatts of electricity to several of thousands of homes. And they're actually looking to export this electricity and supply electricity to neighboring islands such as Martinique and Guadeloupe as well. And this would significantly make people more resilient by reducing the cost of electricity for customers. And, you know, the people from our past, or indigenous ancestors, they also sought after these, you know, geothermal or sulfur landscapes associated with the volcanism. And they also, in a sense, saw it as a landscape of opportunity, as it had cultural and religious significance. So, you know, although this kind of landscape, this geodynamic setting is inherently destructive, they believe that, you know, the sulfur springs were believed to house gods or to actually be gods. And we can also build resilience through medical plants. So in the Caribbean, we've undergone a lot of geological and biogeographic events which have promoted diversity in several different areas, one of them being biodiversity. And in addition to our social history, over the last 500 years, we've seen influx of settlers and colonizers, which brought with them different crops and plants. And, you know, that has contributed significantly to our biological diversity. And, you know, we have a mix of different exotic and native species because of that. So this is just some examples here of some, herbs and plants that we use. In Jamaica, we make use of moringa, the seeds and the leaves, and lemongrass, also known as fever grass here in Jamaica, as the name suggests, used to treat fevers, headaches, stomach indigestion, and several other things. And in the Caribbean, the use of plants and herbs for healthcare is such a significant part of our culture. We've been able to maintain that from for such a long time. We've carried that tradition. And, the enslaved Africans and the indigenous people, they were able to exchange knowledge, and we've been able to carry that knowledge with us today. And that is so important in sustaining a culture and sustaining our cultural identity and being resilient. So this is just a table showing different studied areas across the Caribbean and Latin America, different plant species, medicinal plant species that they possess, and the percentage of those that are native to those countries. There are ways where we can actually further the resilience of our biodiversity, and in doing so, further our resilience. And I think there's more need for more mainstream coverage of such plant knowledge, to further supplement oral traditions and to bring forth or highlight more indigenous voices to give us awareness of probably, plants that we don't know about, and how to use them. And secondly, we can look into safeguarding our native plant species by developing a tissue bank. So, in any case of, for example, a volcanic eruption and lava flows wipe out some of those species, we'll no longer have them. So I think it's important to have a bank or some kind of storage facility where we can, if we need to replant these plant species, we can do that. So this is to further safeguard or biodiversity. And folklore. So Caribbean people, we love to tell stories, we love fiction and proverbs to capture the essence of life, its lessons, its rewards, its dangers. And in Bahamas, you actually have a story of Lusca, a half shark, a half octopus who lurks within the blue holes of the Caribbean, but primarily within the blue holes of Andros Island. She's seen as like this, this guardian of that environment, of all the marine animals, as this protector. And so in one sense, it's like she creates an awareness of that environment and the need for protection, since, they do possess ecological and archaeological value. The Lucayans, the natives of Bahamas, they actually regarded these blue holes as spiritual grounds and used them for burial. And the duality of it is that while she, encourages this awareness and appreciation of the ecology and the environment, she also, creates this sense of warning associated with that kind of environment, because they do pose a danger to people. In the tale, she's believed to drown divers, explorers, and any people who would venture into that area. The currents were believed to be her breath. So, when she would breathe in, it'd create these whirlpools and take people under, So, Bahamians, they'd avoid these environments because, as I said, they do pose a threat to people. So it creates like a more personal resilience and makes people more aware of the dangers associated with certain environments and certain phenomena. And we can build resilience through proverbs. So there's a Haitian proverb in Creole. Maybe somebody in the live audience can correct me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. Haiti c'est glace, which reads, Haiti is slippery ground. And I think I can draw parallels to Catherine's earlier poem by Kai Miller, when they talked about landmarks slipping or the earth becoming unfixed due to earthquakes. It conveys this complexity of the nature of the country and unpredictability of life. And, we can think about it being applied to, the recent earthquakes, which have unfortunately devastated the country. The recent 2021 earthquake in August, which has caused widespread death and injury and loss of homes and buildings and such. And we can also look into indigenous knowledge. In the Caribbean, we don't really tap much into our indigenous knowledge or their practices. We see that more in Latin America, more so in Asian countries. But there's opportunity for us to listen to what they have to say, for them to share their experiences. And so we can discuss strategies to increase our awareness and our understanding of the risks they face and their needs. And so we can kind of collaborate and create culturally sensitive tools to, reduce disaster risk with their experience in building resilience. So to kind of, go into, the past, we've seen certain patterns, where they build settlements along the rivers and seas, and in some islands, in some areas, they actually built houses on stilts, like in Cuba. And we wonder, was this the response to climate-induced sea level rise and flooding? Could we adopt similar strategies? And generally, we don't have much understanding or knowledge of their disaster risk strategies. And could that prompt us to look more or to dive deeper into what these strategies were and see how maybe, if possible, they can be implemented? So this is the National Two Shells Council of Guyana that actually represent the voice of Indigenous people. And in the disaster management bill in Guyana, which is being developed, they're looking to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, and the National Two Shells Council is sort of like a stakeholder they've taken on to, listen to the voice of Indigenous people as it relates to, drought mitigation and how the country can better address that. So to close, we can seek strength and inspiration from our environment and heritage, move ourselves forward, protect us from dangers, and create resilience on a personal, national, and regional level. We can look into our farming practices and medicinal plants. We can further develop sustainable energy sources, look into our folklore and proverbs. What do our stories tell us? Look into the knowledge of our Indigenous people. We definitely need to tap into that more in the Caribbean. So that closes my presentation, and I'll hand over to Shireen to close our presentation.
Thanks, Georgianne. Thank you to all our presenters. But before we wrap up, there are some final thoughts. I see Georgianne gave you a little bit of geomythology, and there's so much that we can learn from the storytelling and the myths that we have that just surround our region, just learning from each other. But some final thoughts here sort of pulls that thread of the outdoors, that thread of the sites, that thread of the monuments, that thread of the landscape, and how the landscape teaches us and helps us to become resilient. We want to pull that thread through museums. And I'm using museums here in the term modern museums, not in the traditional sense, and the role that modern museums play in resilience. Our museum programming is no longer locked in a building. And yes, I appreciate that you already go out, as museum curators and as museum education officers, we go out into the community. But what this allows us is to create self-directed tours so that your audience can now become immersed in their own experience. In the same way you create a diorama, for example, in a museum, and somebody walks in and they can feel it. The out of doors is the diorama. Everything that you create, the programming now is transfixed on a device, on the internet. A teacher can utilize your heritage walk, your tour that is created through your museum program to direct students towards specific information and landscapes and the history and the heritage, not just history as dates, but history as events, history as connecting people. So we connect the landscape, we connect the people, we connect the stories, and this provides an opportunity for a community And that community can be the global community. That community can be the Eastern Caribbean community. It can be the entire Caribbean region on the whole, to look at and to interact with, to learn about and learn from the past and from past environments without actually visiting a physical building, unless the building is part of the tour, of course. While they, and they can do this while they're going about their ordinary business. So, you know, for example, people just walking through downtown of their capital city, for example, on a regular trip to the city or for work, they can see these markers, and subliminally this information gets entrained, ingrained, and fused to your senses. And then your resilience, your preparedness, your awareness becomes second nature. And I think that's the message we want to bring for you today, that we want what we have presented, all of what we've presented, when we're looking at our programming, to start from substrate, from the land, and move through to all of the intangibles, because with this, we have a real experience for people to be able to connect. And so with that, I am going to thank my presenters, Kathy, Georgianne, Stephanie, and you for listening. We appreciate all of your questions that you will have, and we are looking forward to discussions in our live session. So thank you very much.
All right. So thank you to everyone who's been listening. That was a fabulous, extremely informative, and also like very interesting. There's so much digital content out there and so many ways to use digital content to help us. But I'm sure we have lots of questions coming, but what we'd like to do right now is open up the floor to our presenters to add any more comments they would like to, or continue the discussion from our presentation.
Thank you, Katrina. I wanted to extend the discussion first with Stephanie, who you haven't seen or heard from yet. Stephanie, what we'd like to know just a little bit is, how do you build resilience in a place that is constantly in disaster, a place that is disaster prone, a location like so many of our Caribbean islands? You know, one might ask, how can you be resilient if you're constantly flooding or having volcanic ash fall on your house? You have, you're muted.
Okay, yes. So it's how to ensure resilience in the face of vulnerability. And the important thing to remember is to always have plans in place. So ensure that there's comprehensive plans, disaster preparedness and mitigation guidelines are in place beforehand. It's something that it's very important. It needs to include every single facet, has to be in place before a disaster so that it can smoothly transition at the time of when these hazards occur. This would involve, firstly, risk assessments. So the risk assessments have to be involve the weather-related and the geophysical hazards that we have. So again, the ones that are more related to climate change and the earthquakes and volcanoes. It has to take into account the handling and salvaging of artifacts, specific techniques used for individual artifacts, so that if partnerships need to be made with different institutions, then you can do so, so that, again, it's important the system is in place at the time of the greatest need. Ensure that there's emergency supplies. Ensure in terms of just pertaining to the museums, ensure that there are insurance agencies. If there is, depending on the type of disaster, ensure there's a basement, a vault-like basement, and it will be utilized depending on, again, the severity, depending on the type of disaster. Ensure also that there are instructions, warnings for each stage, that there's plans in place for responding to each stage of warning that you might hear. So again, mechanisms can just flow into place. This is again where I'm incorporating Shireen's presentation. Make sure you utilize the virtual cataloging before a disaster. Again, there was a beautiful picture shown of the war monument. Make sure that you have these kind of pictures, these videos, anything in place before, so that they can be utilized after the disaster. So again, the point is to just preserve the cultural heritage.
Great. Oh, sorry. I thought you were finishing up. I'm sorry.
Sorry, one more point. One more point. Involve the communities, because that is how, when you have the outreach programs, that is how you get everybody involved. That's how you have an interest constantly being fostered in these kind of things, because you can have the partnerships with the communities to either store their artifacts or anything like that in place. Because the key thing to remember is that once you can ensure the communities are also involved, that's how you provide social resilience as well. That's it.
Thanks, Stephanie. There's a question, but before I take that question, which I think some of what I might ask Georgianne to speak about will respond to some of this. It's about funding and the possible redirecting of funding from communities. And I wanted Georgianne to elaborate a little bit before we dive into completely answering that question about how museums and well, countries and their heritage sites, how they would benefit, or their heritage spaces would benefit from geothermal plants. If you can expand on that a little bit, because I think the connection needs to be made where we're within the context of what we're talking.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of opportunity comes from cheaper electricity costs, and museums and different heritage spaces definitely can benefit from that. You know, museums consume a lot of energy, so having a constant, reliable, and cheap source of energy can definitely make museums and other archival spaces and heritage sites definitely more resilient. So even considering temperature and humidity control for museums, a lot of collections and artifacts their longevity is dependent on different temperature and humidity settings. And you know, museums are not only a place for storage and for viewing, they're also a place for safeguarding these collections. And we want to ensure that with these systems, and also, you know, thinking about the lights for the displays, and, you know, possibly with reduced electricity costs, more funding and more money can be funneled into more things. So even as Stephanie touched on, they could possibly have more money to funnel into developing mitigation strategies and developing or developing their infrastructure, so they can better safeguard themselves and the heritage and their collections against disasters and hazards that they are vulnerable to.
So, having spoken about the funding that you can get from even reducing your fixed costs, I'm gonna try to respond to Marishana's comment or question here. The idea of using augmented reality and virtual reality is not by way of diverting or redirecting funding, but rather allowing the communities to become more engaged. Because if I travel to a location and I am using my phone or my tablet, I'm going through these communities on my own, which means whatever the community, the development on the ground, whatever the communities have to offer, I'm going to partake of it. My lunch won't be just because I'm in the city, but I'm able to tour myself. I'm able to go to smaller places, smaller locations, and have a beer somewhere, or have a sandwich, or eat some Creole food. The point is that it doesn't go by itself, but rather it has to be holistic in its development. In a similar way how geoparks function, the local community must be a part of the whole dynamic and the whole expansiveness of such an activity, because you don't want to isolate the communities, because it's these same communities people will be touring to see the heritage spaces and heritage sites. They could benefit from the collective collection of the cost of an app, for example, to have their roads and their lights and all of this, these kinds of things put in place. So it's not, the augmented reality and virtual reality are not meant as suggestions to augment the actual processes on the ground, to disaggregate the processes on the ground, but rather to augment them and to allow the local community to play a role in their own tourism and tourist development. And having said that, because I don't see any additional questions just yet, and maybe this will tease a few. Kathy, within the context of geodiversity, and I think maybe you could lend a little bit more about how we can use geodiversity in the Caribbean as a region, not just Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados, but generally as a region. How can we utilize geodiversity as a larger vehicle for resilience?
I think that, something that we touched on earlier is the diversity of the tectonic processes and how dynamic it is, and how that also, though we have this region and this Caribbean plate, we have diversity in terms of the geology of the different islands and the processes, and that corresponds to the diversity of the people. And one way of doing that, I think, of making it possible to create more resilient societies through education. I find that so often we're not teaching the Caribbean as a region, but instead using examples from other places. If educators, whether you're at the undergraduate, I should say higher education, or whether you're informal educators or even in the schools, you're tending to use examples that are from, dare I say it, first world nations that don't really resonate with people in the Caribbean region. And so why not focus on what we can offer? It is so amazing, so incredible. And I see that as a way of bringing in more people who want to do their work in collaboration with us, and also then extending that out to the tourist sector. I think of ways in which we can promote these tours, can be packaged and used in hotels. They can be used on the various cruise liners that keep coming through the Caribbean to help inform the people who are visiting these countries, as well as those of us who live in the Caribbean. Yeah. So that's what I would focus on: teaching the Caribbean, bringing it home, owning and understanding our landscape and our processes, and that will lead, that level of knowledge and understanding can help build a resilient community, a resilient society.
It's interesting you say that, Kathy, because many times when we're teaching, our textbooks are North American or European, and we don't have all of we don't have content that we're sharing from the Caribbean. And so it sort of behoves us to compile, if I will, the examples that are present, and then, in our larger discussion, to be able to plug that into our everyday lives, so that people can, in their daily walk, just understand why we have volcanoes here, why we don't have volcanoes here, why we have mountains that are high here and mountains and small hills. Why is Trinidad different from the rest of the Caribbean? Why, a lot of these questions, a lot of these answers, the endemism is based on our substrate. It's based on on the land. And so, you know, it is for us, whether we're doing art or we're doing history. You know, we teach a lot of Caribbean history, but are we really teaching Caribbean history? You know, in a way that people are connected to it. And so I think the last thing I wanted to mention with our, before I ask if you guys have any closing 1-second comments, is that within context, and you mentioned it a little bit, our literary works, if we go through all of our books, you know, Escape to Last Man Peak, for example, we are talking all the time in our books, our poetry, you know, we talk about the lush green cane fields, and we're talking about the Spanish needle, and a lot of what we grew up learning, a lot of what we grew up hearing, the folk tales, the stories, the books, even the images on the covers of our books, has to do a lot with Caribbean heritage, and has to do a lot with what the landscape had to offer, not only our ancestors, but also within our current sphere. And I think if we were to connect more, we would have more social justice conversations. We would have more conversations about how we fall into our history, or how our history falls on us, and be able to expand that into our everyday coming and going. So I think that's it from me for the session. I don't know if you guys have any 10-second closing remarks before our session disappears. But you know, thanks to everybody, thanks to all of you, and thanks to the audience for listening and participating.
And thank you to all of the presenters. Really appreciate your input and all the knowledge you shared. So that brings this session to a close. If you have questions, or if you still have questions, or if you'd like to connect with the speakers, feel free to click on the networking menu on the left-hand side of your screen, where you can scroll through the list of attendees and presenters and start a conversation. Now, stay tuned for the next session, Verve Creations Mix and Sip. So, you know, be prepared to do your own mixing and sipping, and that starts at 3:30 p.m. Remember that to find the next session, you simply need to click on the sessions menu and scroll down the list to find the next session on the schedule. If you have any questions, feel free to click on the chat icon on the lower left side of your screen to ask for help and get guidance about how to navigate our conference platforms from one of our knowledgeable conference ushers. So we will see you soon.